Welcome to On the Moneyline, a podcast by MMA Play 365. I'm Newsome and I'm here to break down UFC 288. We've got a phenomenal card, a phenomenal pay-per-view going down this weekend, which is headlined by a bantamweight championship fight between Aljamain Sterling, the current champion, and finally the returning Triple C, Henry Cejudo. It's a fight I'm really looking forward to. Henry Cejudo, I'm a massive fan. I was devastated when he retired. I think he's one of the best athletes that we've ever seen in the UFC. Insane wrestling, gold medalist in the Olympics in freestyle wrestling, a two-weight champion as well, former bantamweight champion as he was when he retired, and then a former flyweight champion as well. So Henry Cejudo's got everything about him to make fights fun, well-rounded, and I just can't wait to see him back in the cage. And he's got a phenomenal opponent in front of him in Aljamain Sterling, who's just improving from fight to fight, going strength to strength, and he's absolutely massive for the division as well. So there's nothing to not like about this main event and this bantamweight championship fight. And then before we even get into that fight, on the night, we've got a 5-round co-main event for a non-title fight, which is very rare, between Belal Muhammad and Gilbert Burns, which again, I think 5 rounds does this fight absolute justice, between two fighters who are on the verge of that title shot. Both have got absolute solid cases for that next title shot. Only one of them can have it though, and I think the UFC have made a really good decision in matching these two guys, especially over 5 rounds as well. I think that shows intent for whoever wins this fight will get that next title shot. So we're going to unravel it all, and we're going to start in that main event for the bantamweight championship between Aljamain Sterling and Henry Cejudo. And this is probably going to be one of those breakdowns where I spend a little bit longer than what I should. But it's an amazing fight. We've got the return of a former double champion, and he's going straight back into that title fight. And, you know, that's something that you've got to take into consideration as well. There's a reason why the UFC are putting a 36-year-old bantamweight straight into a title fight after being off and having a layoff for 3 years. And let's not forget as well that Henry Cejudo actually retired. So, you know, the UFC are now bringing a former retired fighter from a 3-year layoff, who was a 36-year-old bantamweight, into a title fight. And there's a reason for it. Look, Henry Cejudo, when he retired, I think it was a big shock to everybody. He was, like I said, a double champion. He's a former Olympic, well, no, he is an Olympic gold medalist in freestyle wrestling. And Henry Cejudo was literally running through everybody that the UFC put in front of him. He absolutely retired on top at the height of his peak, and that's why it was a surprise. But I kind of get it at the same time. He felt like, you know, there was nothing left for him to achieve. So that's why I decided, you know, to take a break and hang the gloves up. I think we all expected him to come back at some point just because of the way he retired, how much of a shock it was. And it's very rare that fighters retire at the height of the peak. It's normally, you know, when they're on a little bit of a decline, or when they're absolutely on a decline and they're getting knocked out. And I think that's an important point to make in this fight as well. Like I say, you know, Henry Cejudo was never on a decline. He was still absolutely in his prime and doing everything that he needed to do to be that elite fighter at the top of 2 divisions. So that's important. And it's also important when it comes to the layoff as well. Take Jon Jones, for example. When these elite fighters have these types of layoffs, 2 to 3 years, and then they come back, as long as they've not been just sitting on the couch for those 3 years, which Henry Cejudo hasn't. He's been training, he's been helping fighters, he's been coaching, he's been cornering. Sure, he will have, you know, took some time off and enjoyed life and spent it with his family and all that good stuff. But the fact that he's still been in the gym, the fact that he's still been helping fighters through camp, championship fighters as well, Davison Figueiredo, for example, and cornering these fighters, you don't do those types of things if you're not in the gym constantly. So Henry Cejudo's still been in and around mixed martial arts. He's not taken that time off by, you know, sailing across the seas or sitting on his sofa or anything like that. He's still been relatively active. And that was the same with Jon Jones as well. And you saw when Jon Jones came back after 3 years, which I was sceptical of because there was a change of weight division there as well. And let's not forget, with Jon Jones, there's an argument that he was looking the worst he ever had in his career before he decided to move up to that division and take that 3 years off. He went up there, came back in the cage after 3 years, completely reset, revived, and absolutely ran through Cyril Gane. So I think the layoff is not important in this fight. I think Cejudo is not going to show a declined version of himself. I think, in fact, if anything, he's going to show the best version of himself still, because he was still in his prime. And sure, the word retired was used, but it was 3 years, and 3 years for an elite fighter, I just don't think there's going to be ring rust involved. I just don't think it's going to play that much of an effect. Look, if this was a fighter in the UFC that had 2 or 3 fights and then took 3 years off, who was maybe 23, 24 years old, maybe that's different. Also, if this was Henry Cejudo that had 6 or 7 years layoff, different. But for an elite fighter at this level, even if Henry Cejudo loses this fight, I just don't think it's going to be because he's had a layoff. It'll be because Aljamain Sterling, was the better fighter. And listen, I've spent a lot of time on Cejudo already. Moving over to Aljamain Sterling, look, Aljamain Sterling, the other thing to really focus on in this fight that a lot of people are talking about is how big Sterling is for the division. And the dude is absolutely huge, to the point where, it's tough to imagine how bad that weight cut is. But it's not as if he has a bad weight cut. He never, or at least he never looks like he does. He comes in there, he's physically in shape. He doesn't look, horrific on the scales. When he fights inside the cage, he can go 5 rounds. He can take a punch as well. So all these things, Sterling's a physical specimen in there for sure. But at some point, I think the featherweight division is going to be calling him just because he is that big. And the thing is with Henry Cejudo, he's a flyweight coming up to bantamweight. But again, just to really counter the size differential here, sure, Sterling's a big bantamweight. I get that 100%. But Henry Cejudo was also a very big flyweight. And I think the bantamweight division for Cejudo, although he is 5'4", he's going to have a significant height and reach disadvantage against Sterling. I do think it's the best weight division for him. But for these physical traits that Cejudo is going to have as a disadvantage here, I also think he's going to be a quicker mover. I think he's going to be the more elusive mover. I think he's going to be the one that's slicker in and out of range as well. So I think for Sterling, his advantages here are going to be to get a hold of Cejudo, try and use his strength, push him up against the cage. I think from a striking perspective, the fight's going to be super fun. Sterling's not as technical as Cejudo in my opinion, but he still throws volume. And listen, judges score volume, they don't score technique. So, from Sterling's perspective, I think he's going to keep up with the numbers on Cejudo, but I just feel that Cejudo's got a couple of weapons on the feet that maybe he's going to be able to shut Sterling down. And the first weapon that I'm talking about is that low kick. Man, Henry Cejudo packs power into that low kick. Look at that fight with Cruz. It's not as if he's just digging bit by bit at that calf. He is literally putting as much power as he can into those low kicks, and they are devastating. And even if he doesn't take Sterling out, I don't think he's going to take him out by low kicks, although I wouldn't be shocked. I just think it could potentially slow Sterling down, get him thinking about the low calf kick, and that'll allow Cejudo to come inside of boxing range, land 2, 3, 4 punch combinations, and I think that's the range where Henry Cejudo's going to have the most success here. I don't think Sterling's going to be anywhere near as comfortable inside those close quarters, inside that boxing range where it is going to be exchanging punches, uppercuts, hooks. I think Sterling's going to be better suited on the outside where he can use his kicks, where he can use the length of his arms, the reach advantage that he's got. I think it's going to be a 7.5 inch reach advantage. So it's going to be out on the outside where I think Sterling has the most success in regards to the striking. But when you're looking at the wrestling and grappling, look, Sterling's got a big grappling advantage over Cejudo. So I think I give Cejudo the very slight striking advantage. But Aljamain Sterling's backpack is one of the best backpacks in the UFC. If he gets on your back, the likelihood is he's either going to choke you out or you're going to be on your back for the remainder of the round and therefore lose the round. Aljamain Sterling does a really, really good job of controlling the back once he's there. But the thing is with Henry Cejudo, I feel like for Sterling to take the back, he's going to have to potentially hop on the back, like in a clinch, scramble, exchange, and he just sticks a hook in and then just hops on the back of Cejudo. And the reason I say that is because for Aljamain Sterling to get in a dominant position on the mat, he's going to have to take Cejudo down. Now, Cejudo is going to be much smaller than him, so this is where the height disadvantage for Cejudo actually becomes an advantage, because Sterling to shoot on Cejudo's got to shoot much lower. He's got to get in on the hips and take Cejudo down. But Cejudo's actually the better wrestler. Like I've said a couple of times, or maybe more than a couple of times already, Henry Cejudo's an Olympic gold medalist in freestyle wrestling. Freestyle wrestling is the type of wrestling, in my opinion, that has that better adaptation within MMA as well. So for Sterling to go in there and take Cejudo down, I'd be surprised. But if he does take him down, Cejudo's got a really quick scramble where he won't lay flat on his back and accept position. he'll instantly be trying to explode and cause these chaotic scrambles to get back up to his feet. So I think for Sterling, with this backpack situation, I wouldn't rule it out, but I think it's definitely going to be harder for him in this fight. So between both fights, I mean, Cejudo, from a wrestling perspective, I'm not sure how many takedowns he does attempt against Sterling, but Sterling can be taken down himself. As good as a wrestler as Sterling is, which he is, there's holes in his game there. You know, Jan took him down, I think, like 6 or 7 times. And even in that second fight with Jan, he had some good top control time as well. So although Cejudo's not the greatest topside BJJ player, I definitely think Cejudo can take Sterling down. And I do think he can be able to get some ground control time in there as well. How much of it, I'm not too sure. But as you can tell from my breakdown, look, this is a phenomenal fight. And it really is, when you're matching them up fighter with fighter, Sterling versus Cejudo, striking versus striking, wrestling versus wrestling, grappling versus grappling, it is a really, really good fight. I just feel that the time for Sterling to come into the featherweight division is very apparent here. I think that after this fight, it will definitely be a consideration, a strong consideration, especially with Merab Dvalishvili coming up as well. And both of these guys have said they're not going to fight each other. And I think it's a perfect time for Henry Cejudo to come back. I think it's definitely going to be the hardest opponent Sterling's faced in the UFC. And maybe you can make that argument for Cejudo as well. But I think Cejudo's got the skill set. I think he's got the qualities. He's got the cardio, the pressure. I think he's got power as well, sneaky power for the division. And I think the pace that he's going to be able to set in this fight is going to be really difficult to keep up for Sterling, especially when the fights go into the 4th and 5th round. I think Sterling could potentially, if he does start slowing down, I think Cejudo will take over. Like I said, really close fight. We've got to pick a winner though, and my winner is Henry Cejudo to become the new UFC bantamweight champion. And in the next fight, in the co-main event, one I've already mentioned in the introduction of this episode of the podcast, we've got the 5-round non-title fight co-main event between Belal Muhammad and Gilbert Burns. And like I said, this is a really good fight. I'm so glad that they've made it 5 rounds. Again, like I've already said, it shows intent from the UFC that whoever wins this fight is very likely going to get that next shot after Leon Edwards versus Colby Covington, because that does look like it's going to be the next title fight. And I think, or I wouldn't be surprised if the UFC have already got that fight in the works, in discussions, and ready to get that booked between Edwards and Covington. So for me, the winner of this fight getting the winner of that fight would be absolutely perfect. And the UFC have made this 5 rounds for a reason, and that's why I think there's intent for something really good for the winner of this fight. Both fighters are deserving of it. And again, like I've just mentioned in the last fight as well, stylistically, this is a really well-matched fight. You've got Belal Muhammad, who seems to be at his physical peak. You know, he's looking bigger, he's looking stronger, he's looking more comfortable inside the cage than he's ever looked before. And he's on this rise, and the rise up to the top of the division. You know, I think 3 or 4 years ago, a lot of people would have been surprised that Belal was in this spot, and they might say the same thing with Gilbert Burns, because listen, Gilbert Burns is at the height of his career right now as well. And like I said, it's a really good fight. When you're looking at it from a striking perspective, I think Belal Muhammad and Gilbert Burns, from a technical perspective within the striking, are very close, well matched. I think Belal Muhammad's going to have a volume edge here, and I think maybe a bit of a slight technical advantage as well, but only very slight in regards to that. But I do think Belal's going to have the volume advantage. And Gilbert Burns on the other side, he should have the power advantage. He's got power in both hands. He's scored big knockouts with both hands. So it's going to be one of those where it's going to be Burns with the power. Belal Muhammad's going to try and calm everything down a little bit, keep the fight set at his pace, dictate the range because of that as well, and really just try and pick Gilbert Burns apart. Now, when it comes to wrestling, this is where it gets interesting, because Gilbert Burns has actually become a decent wrestler, and he's scoring a lot of takedowns in his fights. And this is great from somebody who's an elite BJJ black belt, a world-class grappler, to now have good wrestling. So this is suiting Gilbert Burns perfectly, but I think he's going to run into a bit of a problem here. Firstly, like I've already said, Belal Muhammad physically is looking bigger and stronger, and any fighter that has built themselves up in regards to their physique, is strong, and is able to keep good balance, it's always going to be a first line of takedown defense. And a very helpful first line of takedown defense as well. But then Belal Muhammad's genuinely got good takedown defense in regards to, the fundamentals, doing things right, spreading his base, getting his underhooks, pushing the head down, being able to get away from the cage and separate the hands when fighters are trying to take him down. He's genuinely got good takedown defense. I think it's like 93% takedown defense. So I think for Gilbert Burns, although he's been successful in regards to taking his opponents down lately, I think he's going to have a problem with Belal Muhammad. And is Muhammad actually going to take Gilbert Burns down? I don't know. Maybe he does. I think if he does, he can actually stay safe as well. I don't think it's going to be one of those where Belal takes Burns down and Burns submits him off his back or sweeps or reverses him. I think Belal does a good job of just keeping everything safe. He's a very meat and potatoes type of fighter, and I don't mean that disrespectfully. I just mean that he's not really a specialist in any one area, but he's so good everywhere and he just gets the job done. He's efficient in what he does. And I think that's actually going to be difficult for Burns. I think Burns fights better against the more elusive guys, the more explosive guys, where he can explode into as well, or he can react into takedowns and all that sort of stuff. For a fighter like Belal, who tries to calm the fight down in regards to pace and range and just fighting his fight. And I think that's where Gilbert Burns might struggle here, because Burns is going to be the one that will want to get things going, to build up that pace, to fight at a higher pace, and over 5 rounds as well. I think that kind of favours Belal. I think over 3 rounds, I think the fight's much closer, if I'm being honest. And those first 3 rounds might be close, but when you're looking at rounds 4 and 5, I'm not saying Burns is going to be out of there. There was a question mark on Burns years ago with his cardio. I don't think it's a question mark anymore. I genuinely think Burns has got okay cardio, but I think efficiency down the stretch into those championship rounds, the 4th and 5th rounds, I think Belal's got an advantage there as well, and I think he's going to do the better work the longer the fight goes on. The other thing that's quite concerning as well is Gilbert Burns in his last fight against Jorge Masvidal. Bear in mind, Gilbert Burns was a massive favourite in that fight, so you can say what you want with Masvidal, or he's been an elite fighter, he's experienced, and he has all this top championship level experience, but with Jorge Masvidal, he was a massive underdog, so Gilbert Burns was expected to go in there and take Masvidal out. And although only one judge scored the first round for Masvidal, I personally scored the first round for Masvidal as well. I think Gilbert Burns dropped a round against Masvidal. So if he's dropping around against that version of Masvidal, I think he drops rounds against Belal Muhammad as well. Burns didn't get Masvidal out of there. Belal Muhammad's relatively durable himself. So yeah, I think that the 5 rounds slightly favours Belal. I think with Gilbert Burns dropping around against Masvidal, in my opinion, and also one judge's opinion as well, and that fight actually being much closer than what the bookies' odds suggested, I think Belal Muhammad's a much better version of that version of Jorge Masvidal. I think Belal Muhammad's got a good fight here to be able to take the fight late, stretch Gilbert Burns down into the 4th and 5th rounds and do really good work. So for those reasons, I'm picking Belal Muhammad to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got a fun one between Jessica Andrade and Xiaonan. I think it's a really well-matched fight. Stylistically, I think both fighters are going to pose problems for each other. I'm just a little bit unsure of where Jessica Andrade is at right now, and this is my problem that I've got with her, because I bet against Andrade in her last fight against Erin Blanchfield. And bear in mind, if you go back and listen historically to my podcasts and me breaking Andrade fights down, I absolutely love Jessica Andrade. She's one of my favourite fighters in the UFC in regards to just putting on entertaining fights, swinging big bombs. She's got good wrestling, she's got good grappling, good top control where she'll land ground and pound, look for submission. She's just a really, really exciting fighter to watch. And I bet against her last time out against Erin Blanchfield, because I believe Blanchfield just had this huge grappling edge over her. A grappling edge that Jessica Andrade wasn't really used to. And I thought that Blanchfield was going to take it down early, was going to stop Andrade getting back up, or maybe she does get back up once or twice, but Blanchfield really is persistent and relentless with the wrestling, takes her down and does good work. And the end of the fight played out like that, with Andrade getting submitted by Blanchfield, so I wasn't surprised to see that. But what I was surprised to see, and I think what everybody was surprised to see, is that Erin Blanchfield was actually touching Andrade up inside the cage. She was putting it on her. She was landing good shots, good combinations, good hard shots as well. And I think even if you bet Blanchfield in that fight, which, like I said, I did, I think everybody was under the same impression that it was going to be Andrade that was going to have the big striking advantage and Blanchfield that was going to have the wrestling and grappling advantage. But man, Blanchfield looked like she had a striking advantage. And I think with Yan Xiaonan does a really good job with the striking. She's very patient. She doesn't overexert. She'll land a ton of volume on her opponents. And it'll be consistent throughout 3 rounds as well. Good cardio. So with me seeing what Blanchfield did, although fair play to Blanchfield, she is a developing fighter. She's very young. She's going to be getting better from fight to fight. But I still think Yan Xiaonan's a better striker right now than what Blanchfield was inside the cage with Andrade. So this is what I was talking about, where I'm saying I'm not sure where Andrade is at, because I was really, maybe she had an off night. I say this all the time. Athletes in every single sport across the world will have an off night, or an off match, an off game. And I said it with Bruno Silva against Brad Tavares when I was breaking down the Brad Tavares fight. Bruno Silva had a bad night against Meerschaert. He comes back out and knocks out Tavares in round 1. So whether Andrade was just having a bad night, I'm not sure. But if she's susceptible to getting hit as much as she did against Blanchfield in this fight against Yan Xiaonan, I think Xiaonan's going to piece her up. Where I'm worried for Xiaonan is Andrade does have a good wrestling game and a good topside grappling game as well. Now, this does seem to be an area that Yan Xiaonan's improving from fight to fight. We are seeing those developments. But I think if Andrade really goes down the route of the wrestling, being relentless, trying to pick Yan Xiaonan up, slamming her, taking her down, getting top control time, I think Yan Xiaonan's going to be in for a really, really tough night. The thing is, I'm not sure how likely it is for Andrade to have that type of game plan. She doesn't normally, at least as of late, have that type of game plan. She did more earlier in her UFC career, but right now she just does love to plant her feet, stand, strike, be aggressive, push forwards, be a bully. And I think against Yan Xiaonan, that's going to play into a game. So unless Andrade does come here and wrestle and grapple, which we've not seen as much of over the last couple of years, enough that I'd want to see more, I'm going to assume that it's a low percentage probability that she does that against Yan Xiaonan. Although it is a probability nonetheless, I am going to be siding with the striker here. I think that from what I've seen in tape, Andrade last time out is very concerning. I think Yan Xiaonan's going to be able to put some really good strikes together. And if she can win one round and get another round really close with that striking before Andrade does start to have a moment's herself, then I think it's very possible for Xiaonan to win this fight. So for those reasons, I'm picking Yan Xiaonan to win the fight. And we're staying with the fire matchups because here we've got Movsar Evloev versus Bryce Thug Nasty Mitchell. Now for me here, I'm so glad that we've seen Mitchell in his last fight against Topuria, because although Evloev isn't going to bring that same power and that same explosivity into the strikes as what Topuria brought to Mitchell, that fight actually had a decent amount of ground control time in the short time that the fight was actually playing out. And Bryce Mitchell, I was very surprised by Bryce. I bet Mitchell in that fight as an underdog, and I thought that, look, if he gets the fight down to the mat, I think he'll be able to be good enough as a grappler, scrappy, scrambly, and also just having really good fight IQ when it comes to, the ground game and, finding a position he's comfortable in and really putting it on his opponents. I thought Mitchell would have a lot of success on the ground, but he actually didn't, and Topuria had a lot of success over Mitchell, controlled positions. Mitchell was on his back, struggling to get back up. Apparently he was ill, so maybe that does take an effect. And I know people say, oh yeah, it's easy to say that a fighter's ill, but listen, if you've ever been really ill and then you're forced to fight at a UFC level against a killer like Topuria, maybe we can give somebody a pass for that. But the fact is that Topuria was able to have a decent amount of control time and sort of had Bryce Mitchell's number a bit on the mat. And I think if Topuria had that type of success, I definitely think Evloev's going to have that type of success. I think from a striking perspective, the fight's going to be close. I might even give the striking advantage slightly to Mitchell. But the thing is with Evloev, he's got this ability to score takedowns. He's that typical Russian that will get takedowns over almost anybody. And once he gets on top, he just makes things so difficult for his opponents to be able to stand back up. Whether that's laying in one position or transitioning from position to work out where he's most comfortable and then start landing ground and pound. I think Evloev just does such a solid job of staying good on the mat, putting good work in and keeping his opponents down. And I think with Mitchell's not going to lay over here and just allow Evloev to just control him without putting up any sort of fight. That's not how Mitchell's going to operate. Mitchell will initially look to try and escape, sweep, reverse, but I just don't think that even if he does have a little bit of success doing that early in the fight, I don't think that throughout the entirety of the fight, should it go 3 rounds, which I think it's likely to, unless Evloev does find a finish on top, I think that Bryce Mitchell is going to give up a lot of control time. I think he is going to give up takedowns. I do think that he's going to have his moments on the feet. I think he might even have his moments on the ground early on as well. Like I said, if he can get a sweep or reversal, but Evloev's not going to get run over on the mat for the majority of the fight. Like I said, Mitchell might have his moments, but I think Evloev is going to have the majority of the fight, and that's going to be the difference. I do think that it's a bad fight for Bryce Mitchell in regards to how good Evloev is as a wrestler and a topside grappler. Bryce Mitchell normally has the success against the fighters where he has the grappling advantage over them, and I don't think he has the grappling advantage in this specific fight. So for those reasons, I'm picking Movsar Evloev to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got another returning fighter here after a bit of a layoff. We've got Kron Gracie versus Charles Jourdain, and I've been looking to see, what Gracie's been up to, where he's been training, why he's had the layoff. Has it been an injury? Has it just been from a development perspective because he is still a young fighter? And I don't think the UFC quite worked out for him the way he was hoping to in his opening few fights in his UFC career. So I think taking that step away just for, a couple of years is the right move to, hone your skills a little bit, improve on the striking, because we all know that Gracie name. We all know that Kron's going to be an insane grappler, which obviously is. They learn jiu-jitsu before they can walk, I'm pretty sure, in the Gracie family. So just taking that step back, improving the striking, if that's what he's done. If it's been an injury, then, that could change things completely, because he won't have been on the mats and he won't have been developing and improving. But there's not many injuries that keep you out for that long. So I'm kind of leaning on the fact that Kron Gracie's just taken a slight step away just to, reset himself, improve, develop, work on the striking, maybe work on the wrestling as well, because we all know when you've got a world-class grappling game, like I said with Gilbert Burns, you must have a world-class wrestling game to accompany it just to get the fight down to where you're best. So yeah, unfortunately, I couldn't find too much information. And if anyone's listening to this and you've got that info, then yeah, feel free to drop it in the comments. I'd be really interested to see what Kron Gracie's been up to in his layoff. Charles Jourdain, we know all about Charles Jourdain. Very well-rounded fighter, explosive, elusive, moves really well. He's always in for a dogfight if it gets to be a dogfight, and he's a kill or be killed type of fighter as well. Fan favourite. People love to watch Charles Jourdain fight, and there's a reason for it, And he is genuinely good everywhere. He's a good striker. He's got decent wrestling. He's got decent grappling. So Charles Jourdain here for me, based on what I've seen from Kron Gracie before the layoff, because that's the only thing I can really go off here. I think Charles Jourdain is going to be absolutely the better striker. But I think Kron Gracie is going to be the better grappler, and it makes for a good stylistic matchup. The questions that I've got is Kron Gracie going to look so much better from a striking perspective? And he doesn't even need to come into this fight and be a world-class striker. He just needs to come in and be comfortable striking, enough to blend the striking into the wrestling and then get his takedowns and get Jourdain down to the mat. And I think there's holes in Charles Jourdain's ground game enough for Kron Gracie to be a real problem if that fight gets down. And Kron Gracie is going to be a real problem for most fighters anyway. But I do think that Jourdain can give up some positions easily. I think someone like Kron Gracie is going to be able to transition from position to position relatively comfortably against Charles Jourdain as well. It's just, does the fight get down there? And I think for as much advantages as Charles Jourdain's got on the feet striking against Gracie, I think those advantages are just so much more exaggerated on the Kron Gracie side when you're looking at the grappling. I think the gap between Charles Jourdain's grappling and Gracie's grappling is much bigger than the gap is between both fighters and the striking advantage that Charles Jourdain's got. I do think that Gracie's going to come up and we're going to see a better version of him. I do think he's going to have developed during his time off. like I said, there's not many injuries that can keep you out for that long. So I assume he's just been, honing his game and improving and developing. So I think Gracie's going to have a good fight back here. I do have concerns with Charles Jourdain when the fight hits the mat of him giving up positions, maybe giving up his back, and Kron Gracie just being able to find a submission whilst it's on the feet. I think Jourdain is going to have an advantage, but Kron Gracie, don't be shocked if you see a development within the striking as well. It's a good fight to make. It really is a good fight. It does have some unknowns from my perspective, but I am going to side with the fighter that I think has got the biggest path to victory, the biggest gap in skill, and the fighter that could potentially have made those improvements as well. So for those reasons, I'm picking Kron Gracie to win this fight. And in the next fight, it's going to be a hell on wheels, and I'm pretty sure it's going to be the fight circled by every single fight fan for the potential fight of the night. I think it's going to be the fight where Dana White's saying, if you don't know, now you know. But guess what, Dana? We all know. We've got Drew Dober versus Matt Frevola. We're going to see power. We're going to see explosivity. We're going to see gas tank cardio. We're going to see heart. We're going to see knockdowns. We're going to just see an entertaining fight at 100 mile an hour pretty much from start to finish, and I cannot wait. And if I've just built it up and this is a 3-round split decision with a total of 50 strikes landed between them in the fight, then I'm going to look a bit like an idiot. But look, I just don't see how this fight can't be fun. Matt Frevola is aggressive, in your face. He'll look to try and knock you out at all times. He has no respect for his own cardio, and he does have good cardio as well, and that's probably why he has no respect for it. He'll come forwards and he'll just look to overwhelm his opponents. And the thing is with Drew Dober can fight a really smart fight. He can fight very technical, but he's also a fighter that you can absolutely draw into this type of fight, and I think Frevola's going to do that. I think when Frevola comes forward, I think initially Drew Dober and his coaches, they might say, look, Drew, let's be technical. We're better than him from a technical perspective, which I do believe that he is. But when Frevola comes at him like a steamroller, the nickname plays true, I think Drew Dober's going to accept. I think he's going to accept that invitation to throw down and just turn this fight into, like I said, a fight that's just hell on wheels. And in that type of fight, I think any fighter could win the fight. But the thing is, like I've already alluded to, I do think that Dober is the slightly better technical fighter. I do think that Frevola might have a slight durability edge, though, and that could play a little bit of a factor. I'm not sure. But Drew Dober, for me, is more technical. I think from a wrestling perspective, it is close, but I do give the slight edge to Frevola when it comes down to the grappling. I just don't think that either of these fighters are going to be able to keep their opponent flat on the back for too long. So even if there is wrestling here, I think it's going to be one of those wrestling types of exchanges where the judges just see it as a change of position just because there's no grappling done therefore after. I just don't see it. I think if Dober was to take Frevola down, Frevola can get back up and vice versa. I think this is a fight that's going to be won and lost on the feet. I think it's going to be a war. I think it's going to be a brawl. Normally I do side with the underdog in this type of fight. However, I do think that Dober's just that little bit smarter with his striking fight IQ, and I do think he is the slightly more technical striker, and that could play a factor if things do start getting messy in this fight. So for those reasons, I am going to be siding with Drew Dober to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got Devin Clark versus Kennedy Nzechukwu. And the thing is with Devin Clark, straight away I'll jump right into it, is I just don't know what version of Clark we're going to see inside the cage. Like, if this is a wrestling version of Clark that's looking sharp and on point, then I absolutely think that he could beat Kennedy Nzechukwu in this fight. I think he can get the takedowns. I think he can have the top control time. But that's just the if. And the thing is with Devin Clark, like, sometimes his wrestling can look a little bit off in his fights. Maybe it's opponent dependent. And it could very well be opponent dependent. But then in some fights, he looks to want to try and strike and doesn't really look to threaten too much with the wrestling. So the thing is with Devin Clark, it's hard to know what you're going to get inside the cage. With Kennedy Nzechukwu, you know exactly what you're getting. You're getting a 6'5" Nigerian with a huge reach. He's going to have an 8-inch reach advantage over Devin Clark, along with that 5-inch height advantage. Kennedy Nzechukwu, pretty much every fighter wants to take him down. And I don't think Nzechukwu's like this elite striker. He's a good striker, a long striker. He'll pop good volume out, but I don't think he's this crisp, technical elite Adesanya type of striker, if that makes sense. But he just does a good job of being efficient enough that everyone wants to try and take him down, because it's hard to get in on someone that's got an 83-inch reach, who's 6'5" and athletically gifted as well. So I think with Devin Clark, in this fight, he's going to have to close the distance, get in on the legs of Nzechukwu and take him down. The thing is, it's almost like with Nzechukwu, he's learnt on the job with his takedown defense, because everybody wants to take him down and has pretty much taken him down. If you wanted Nzechukwu down inside the UFC octagon, the likelihood is you've got him down, but he's improved so much with his takedown defense. And even when you look at his numbers, there's some fights where he's conceded 4 takedowns, 5 takedowns, 3 takedowns, but he's still got an 80% takedown defense rate from his statistics perspective. So he is able to defend takedowns. And the thing is, he has multiple wins as well, where he's been taken down a few times and still managed to win the fight. So what does that tell you? That tells you that his get-up game's getting good as well. I think unless Nzechukwu's really got a world-class BJJ black belt on him, I think that's where they'll slice through Nzechukwu. But in this fight, Clark isn't that. Can Clark get takedowns? Yes, I think he can. Can he hold Nzechukwu down and get some top control time? I think he can get some top control time. I'm not going to say that he can't, but I just don't think that the fight's going to be won and lost due to Devin Clark taking Nzechukwu down and laying on top of him. I just really don't. I think Nzechukwu's going to be the better striker here. I think he's going to land more volume. I think he's going to make it very difficult for Clark to get in close and therefore shoot a takedown. I think Clark's might be liable as well for Nzechukwu landing something up the middle, like a knee, for example, on a takedown if Clark is turning relentless. And I think in the early moments of this fight, Nzechukwu is going to get worked by Clark. But I do think that the longer the fight goes on, the less and less likely it is for Clark's wrestling and grappling game to be successful. I think that's going to hurt the morale of Clark inside the cage as well. I think it's going to allow Nzechukwu to grow in the fight the longer it goes on as well. And I just think it's going to be a difficult one for Clark. If Kennedy Nzechukwu was 6'2" and had a 78-inch reach, then I think it'd be a little bit different. I think that Devin Clark might be able to find his way in a little bit easier, but I just think he's in for a tough fight, and the frame and the height of Nzechukwu I think plays a big factor in that. So for those reasons, I'm picking Kennedy Nzechukwu to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got Khaos Williams versus the newcomer Rolando Bedoya. Now, Rolando Bedoya, I'm going to be honest, I'm not overly impressed with what I've seen from him at all in tape. However, there are a few fighters that have come into the UFC looking horrific in tape on the regional scene and look like a totally different fighter and an absolute killer inside the cage, and made the analysis completely and utterly off. But I can only go on what I've seen. And look, Bedoya doesn't do a bad job of coming forwards and wanting to be aggressive and wanting to knock his opponents out, but his striking defense isn't all there. He is hittable. He is available to be taken down. And it just seems like the level of competition that he's been facing is very favourable to him, even though they've had decent records. So, look, Rolando Bedoya could completely prove me wrong. He could come into the cage and look like a beast. But with how open Bedoya is to be hit when he's striking himself, I think Khaos Williams is going to invite that. Khaos Williams will love Bedoya to come forwards and try and land 2 or 3 punch combinations on him. So he opens his guard up and Khaos Williams can land bombs back on Bedoya. I don't think Bedoya's got anywhere close to the power and knockout power that Khaos Williams has got. So I think Williams is going to basically have a fight here against an opponent who's less experienced, who's not fought a level of competition that Khaos Williams is at himself or that Khaos Williams has fought, but he's also going to be fighting an opponent that's going to be stylistically open for Williams to really attack the way he wants to attack, and I think that's going to be the big problem for Rolando Bedoya. I think it's a terrible fight for him, if I'm being honest. When I first saw the betting line, I thought, well, there's got to be some value on Bedoya here, surely, but when I looked into it, I completely understand why the betting line is where it's at. I think Khaos Williams is, like I said, I think he's a killer, and I think he's got a really good opponent in front of him that he's going to be able to land on and land on hard. So for those reasons, I'm picking Khaos Williams to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got a fun fight here between Marina Rodriguez versus Virna Jandiroba. Some people might say, oh, well, why is it fun? Well, listen, I love these types of fights where you've got such a defined stylistic fight between Marina Rodriguez, who's an absolute striker, versus Virna Jandiroba, who's an absolute grappler. And Jandiroba's got holes in her striking, and Rodriguez has got holes in her grappling. So I love this type of fight, because whichever fighter really gets their game going is going to really roll all over their opponent. If obviously that's Jandiroba with the rolling. If Rodriguez, can stay upright, then Jandiroba's just going to get pieced up. So I do think that, look, the betting lines come down a lot. It was around minus 150 to minus 175, depending on where you were at for Rodriguez. But money's coming on Jandiroba. And I always say it, I think these fights should be pick'ems where they are so defined from a stylistic perspective. One fighter's great in one specific area, the other fighter's great in the other specific area, but they've both got weaknesses in their opponent's strengths. Like those types of fights, more often than not, should be a pick'em. So I do understand the line movement. I just think that in this fight, Rodriguez has shown more from a takedown defensive perspective than Jandiroba has shown from a striking defensive perspective, and that might be the element that sways me to one side when I'm making my pick and my prediction. Because for Virna Jandiroba to take Rodriguez down, I think it's possible. But A, I don't think Rodriguez does a bad job with the takedown defense. B, I think Rodriguez has faced better wrestlers and stuffed takedowns from better wrestlers than Jandiroba. And C, I just think that Jandiroba's going to struggle because she doesn't have that open mat wrestling. It's going to be closing the distance, getting into the clinch and then trying to trip Rodriguez down. But by doing that, you're going into the wheelhouse of Rodriguez, who's got that Muay Thai background, slick elbows, knees in close as well, a good Muay Thai plum clinch. So for Jandiroba to get the fight to where she needs to get it to, she's got to go through the strengths of Rodriguez and where Jandiroba's weak as well, or weakest as well. And then you've got to, like I've already said, Rodriguez has fought and defended takedowns against better takedown artists than Jandiroba, in my opinion. So I think that the biggest gap in skill here is going to be the grappling. And this is what makes the fight interesting, because I think if Jandiroba should get on top of Rodriguez, the fight could potentially be a wrap. Whereas, although Rodriguez is going to have a big striking advantage over Jandiroba, I think that grappling, the gap in skill in the grappling is bigger. It's just the likelihood of the fight getting to the mat is not that likely, in my opinion, and it's more likely for the fight to play out on the feet, which plays into Rodriguez's game plan. So it's a really interesting dynamic when you're looking at the fight, but for the reasons that I've mentioned, I am going to be picking Marina Rodriguez to win this fight. In the next fight in the heavyweight division, we've got Parker Porter returning versus Braxton Smith. And I say Parker Porter returning because I'm surprised he's returning this quickly. He suffered a bad knockout against Justin Tafa only a couple of months ago, and it was a bad knockout. One that I was kicking myself a little bit for, actually. Not too much, and I'll explain why, but I was one of not a lot of people that was on the side of Justin Tafa. And I was looking to bet Tafa, and ultimately I didn't pull the trigger. And it was as easy as what I thought it was going to be for Tafa to beat Parker Porter. The reason I'm not kicking myself too much is because it was juice. It's not as if Tafa was an underdog and I'd missed that solid underdog spot. There was juice to be paid on Tafa, and ultimately that's what stopped me pulling the trigger. But I kind of feel like Parker Porter's got a relatively similar fight here against Braxton Smith. Like, Braxton Smith, we don't know everything about him. We don't know what he's going to be like if this fight gets dragged down to the mat. We don't know what this fight is going to be like if it's dragged further on into later rounds 2 and into rounds 3. So there's a couple of unknowns on Braxton Smith's side, but what we do know is the dude hits hard as fuck. Like, when he hits you, normally he's knocking you out. So that's the thing with Parker Porter, I think, and that's what I said with Tafa. I think Tafa had that power to knock Porter out, and I think Braxton Smith's got that power to knock Porter out, but Braxton Smith has got good explosivity as well, whereas Tafa was more rigid, he's more static, and he's more reactive. Braxton Smith will go out and get it. So I actually think that the knockout here is probably a little bit more defined than what it was in the Tafa fight. But like I say, what happens if Porter does take Smith down? We hear about this wrestling of Porter, we hear about the BJJ black belt of Porter, but what actually happens if he takes Smith down? Or what happens if this fight gets extended? I don't know. But what I do know is that Parker Porter can be knocked out. Braxton Smith hits hard as fuck. And Porter is coming back after 2 months from that bad knockout against Justin Taffer. I just think it's a recipe for disaster here for Parker Porter. But obviously, if he does take Braxton Smith down and controls him, and Braxton Smith, the round one knockout guy, ends up gassing out and has no get-up game and no defensive wrestling, am I going to be surprised? No, because I've seen it a million times. But for the sake of the prediction, I'm picking Braxton Smith to win the fight. And in the next fight, we've got newcomer Ikram Aliskerov versus Phil Hawes. And not many fighters make the UFC debut against Phil Hawes, but Aliskerov is a good fighter. He's your typical Russian. He'll look to get the takedowns. He will more than often get the takedowns. Then he's got good top control. He's actually got a nasty Kimura as well, which I think might be the first time that I've ever said that on the podcast, even before MMA Play 365, when I used to run everything from Newsome MMA. I don't think I've ever said or described a fighter as having a nasty Kimura, but this dude's got a nasty Kimura. So I think that Aliskerov in this fight is going to have to mind his P's and Q's early, because Phil Hawes, and I know it's a cliche to say with Phil Hawes, but he is always going to have his best moments early in his fights. And the thing is with Hawes, his gas tank's hit and miss, so sometimes it can be good and sometimes it can be really bad, but I think this is the style of fight where Hawes is going to be forced to wrestle. It's likely going to be a case where the fight goes on into the later rounds, and if there is heavy wrestling throughout the fight, which I think there's going to be, I think this is the type of fight that Phil Hawes will tire in. So Phil Hawes will have to really put it on Aliskerov early, but be very mindful that Aliskerov will be looking for the takedown, and as soon as Aliskerov feels anything of the power of Hawes, he's just going to turn into a more relentless wrestler than what he has looked to be in his career to date, which was already relatively relentless. So I think that Hawes has really got to get this job done early, and this is the problem that I've got for him. I think it is going to be a fight that the storm is going to be weathered on him. I think that it is going to be dragged a little bit later. I think it is a fight that he's likely going to tire out on, and because of that, I do believe that the window of opportunity for Phil Hawes to win this fight is there, but it's also a small window of opportunity. Potentially, your first 2.5, 3 minutes. I think if Aliskerov survives that or gets a takedown within that time, I think the fight is going to be a difficult one for Hawes. Therefore, after, you can never ever underestimate Hawes in regards to landing that big bomb and knocking his opponent out. But it's a tough ask here, and like I said, the window of opportunity is going to be really small before Aliskerov really does start to work his game and get the takedowns and put Hawes on his back and, just grind on him against the cage, make it ugly, drain that gas tank of Hawes. So, yeah, I think it's a tough fight for Phil Hawes, if I'm being honest. I actually like Aliskerov. The only knock on Aliskerov from what I've seen in tape is on one of his fights where it did go 3 rounds. He did tire late in that 3rd round to the point where he was getting teed off on. I think that could be a problem a little bit later down the line for Aliskerov, but I don't think it's necessarily going to be an issue here, because I do think Hawes, if it was to get into that stage and have that type of fight that Aliskerov had with that 3-round fight, in that type of fight, I think Hawes is going to be just more tired anyway. So, yeah, I like Aliskerov. I think he's got a good fight ahead of him here, and for those reasons, I'm picking Ikram Aliskerov to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got Zhalgas Zhumagulov versus the newcomer Rafael Estevam. Now, Zhalgas Zhumagulov must be one of the most unfortunate fighters in the UFC, because he is a good fighter. He always brings it. He always puts on a good performance. He's 1-5 though in his 6 UFC fights on a 3-fight losing streak. But man, obviously there's nothing you can say with the Manel Cap fight because he got knocked out in round 1. But round 1 he was actually looking okay in. And also the Amir Albazi fight as well, that was very clear cut. But outside of that, you've got a split decision loss to Charles Johnson that I thought Zhumagulov won. You've got a split decision loss to Jeff Molina that I thought Zhumagulov won. You've got a unanimous decision against Raulian Paiva, which you can make an argument for that Zhumagulov won. So, man, Zhumagulov's just not had things his way. Especially that Charles Johnson fight last time out. I absolutely thought that he should have had his hand raised there, and you could see the disappointment on his face when it wasn't. Here, though, against Rafael Estevam, Estevam's a very interesting fighter. I think Zhumagulov's going to have some advantages, though. I think he's going to have a striking advantage. I think A wrestling advantage, maybe, I'm not too sure. Listen, the wrestling's going to be close because Estevam is a little bit relentless. He does look like he wants to get fights down to the mat. He's got good top control time, so I think if he does get Zhumagulov down, I think he's going to be able to have a lot of time on top of Zhumagulov. And I think the wrestling, initially, Zhumagulov might be able to defend takedowns, but if Estevam keeps on rinse and repeating and looking to get that fight down to the mat, eventually he's going to get it there. And once he starts getting it there, even if Zhumagulov stands back up, he should be able to rinse and repeat, and Estevam should be able to get Zhumagulov down therefore after. I do think that although I've given the striking advantage to Zhumagulov, Estevam's got decent striking himself. He's not terrible there. I just think if this was a 15-minute kickboxing fight, we'd be looking at Zhumagulov winning, but it's not. It's MMA. I do think the takedown's going to be there for Estevam. I do think that the top control time, once the takedowns are starting to flow, I think the top control time is going to absolutely be there for Estevam as well. And I think Zhumagulov's going to struggle eventually underneath Estevam. So I do genuinely think that the odds should be much closer than what they are. Estevam is a moderate favourite in this fight. I do think it should be closer to that pick'em line, but I do understand why Estevam is the favourite in this fight, especially with the form. And I say that with a heavy heart, unfortunately. The form of Zhumagulov, it's got to be playing a factor in his head in regards to Zhumagulov. He's got to go out there. In his head, he's going to be thinking, I've got to go out there and finish him, because otherwise I'm going to end up facing another split decision loss or close decision loss. So I think the mindset is a worry as well from Zhumagulov's perspective. And, you know, the mind plays, you know, at least 50% of a fighter inside the cage, especially in the UFC. If your mind's not there, or if there's something not right, it can play out in a massive way against your favour. So that's just me making the assumptions on the mindset from what I've actually seen on tape. I think Estevam's a good fighter. He's aggressive enough to close the distance, get the takedowns, and have good work on top of Zhumagulov. He's just got to get the takedowns. If he doesn't shoot the takedowns, then it's going to be a tough fight for him. But I just don't see him not shooting takedowns, especially if Zhumagulov does start to pull away on the feet. So all in all, I think it's going to be a close fight, but I am siding with the newcomer. I'm picking Rafael Estevam to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got Joseph Holmes versus Claudio Ribeiro. Claudio Ribeiro obviously coming back from that bad knockout loss against Razak Al-Hassan in a fight that someone was always going to get knocked out. A lot of people thought it was going to be Al-Hassan getting knocked out, and I was pretty much on the fence with it, to be honest. I didn't really have a strong lean either way. But what I will say is that Claudio Ribeiro legitimately hits like a truck, and he turned Al-Hassan into a bit of a wrestler in that fight as well. You know, before Al-Hassan got that knockout, Ribeiro had Al-Hassan shooting on him. He had to defend a couple of takedowns, but Ribeiro just hit Al-Hassan hard early on, and I think that got a lot of respect from Al-Hassan. So that says a lot, in my opinion, for the power that Ribeiro's bringing inside the cage. Now, with Joseph Holmes, he's a very different type of striker. He's going to be taller, he's going to be longer, he's going to have a reach advantage, he's more calm, he's more patient, and he has a decent ground game as well. I just don't think the fight is going to be won and lost on the ground. I think that even if there's takedowns here, I think Ribeiro will be able to defend takedowns. I don't know. I don't even know who's more likely to shoot. I mean, I don't think it's going to be Ribeiro just because of how much power he packs. Maybe it is Holmes that's the more likely fighter to shoot. I just don't see any of these having a massive advantage in the wrestling and grappling. And with what I'm trying to say, the grappling's key as well, because if Holmes does take Ribeiro down, I don't think the top side grappling is going to be enough to keep Ribeiro down for long enough where it can start affecting the rounds and therefore a decision. So I do think the fight's going to be won and lost on the feet. And they're both going to have very different styles on the feet as well. Like I say, Holmes is going to be the taller, longer fighter who's going to want to keep things on the outside, really slow things down, slow the pace down of the fight, whereas Ribeiro is going to be the one that's going to, A, need to close distance, but B, wants to close the distance, and C, land absolute bombs on his opponent. So I think we're going to see two different styles of striking here. I just feel that Claudio Ribeiro is going to be the fighter and the striker that's going to get through, that's going to be able to have the success in this fight. I don't think Holmes will do a decent enough job of staying on the outside, but I don't think he can do that for the entire fight. I definitely think Ribeiro's going to have moments where he's landing, well, he's being aggressive, he's pushing forwards, he's getting inside boxing range of Holmes and starting to exchange punches. I just don't see a scenario where Ribeiro's going throughout this entire fight without landing something significant, and I think it might only take 1 or 2 punches to really rock or drop Holmes and really change the course of this fight. If Holmes manages to knock Ribeiro out early, I think that's the only way that Ribeiro doesn't land clean on Holmes in this fight. And although it's always a possibility, I just don't see Holmes knocking Ribeiro out early before Ribeiro's had any chance to get going himself. I do think it's a fight where he can get going. I do think it's a fight that Ribeiro's going to have opportunities, and it's those opportunities that I think he's going to take, and Holmes won't be able to survive. So for those reasons, I'm picking Claudio Ribeiro to win this fight. And finally, the last fight we're breaking down, we've got Daniel Willy Cat Santos versus Johnny Munoz Jr. Two fighters that I cashed and won money on in their last fights. Daniel Willy Cat Santos is a nice little underdog. Johnny Munoz Jr. was chalk, but like I say, it was two fights that I was confident in. Both fighters won, and now they're both matched against each other. Kind of wish Daniel Santos was an underdog in this fight, if I'm being honest, but there's a reason he is the favourite. And you know, Johnny Munoz Jr., I don't know whether there's recency bias played into this, because he was, I can't remember what I bet him at last time. I think it was roughly around the -200 mark, but he didn't look anywhere close to -200. It probably wasn't the best bet, if I'm being honest. So I know I bragged and bigged myself up about cashing on Johnny Munoz, but would I bet it again knowing how that fight went down? Probably not. But with Daniel Santos, I think that Santos is going to have a lot of aggression, a lot of forward pressure. And I just don't know if Johnny Munoz had an off night that night. And I know I say this, but it does happen a lot. Athletes have off nights, off matches, off games. And I kind of feel the way Johnny Munoz fought in his last fight, in a fight that I really did think was an amazing stylistic matchup for him, the way that he fought was a little bit underwhelming. So if Johnny Munoz comes into this fight and fights the way I thought he was going to fight last time out, then this fight could be really close. But the thing is with Daniel Santos, like I said, he's a ball of energy inside the cage. His striking's aggressive. His volume's aggressive. He's got decent wrestling. He's got decent grappling as well. And that's the other thing. Like, Johnny Munoz Jr. has normally got the huge grappling advantage over every single opponent he fights. And he might have a grappling advantage here, if I'm being honest. He is a very good grappler. And he might have a very slight wrestling advantage also. But I think Daniel Santos is a good enough grappler to deal with the grappling of Munoz and get back up to his feet. And I think Santos has actually fought better wrestlers and defended takedowns from better wrestlers than Munoz as well. Then when you look at the striking, I think it's Daniel Santos all day long. So that's why, you know, I'm leaning towards Daniel Santos. Kind of wish he was an underdog. If he was, I would 100% bet Daniel Santos in this spot as an underdog, but he's not. He's a moderate favourite. So like I say, a little bit disappointing, but it's a good fight nonetheless. And the fact this is the first fight on the card as well speaks volumes to this event. For this fight though, I'm picking Daniel Willy Cat Santos to win the fight. And that's all for this episode of the podcast. As always, thank you for tuning in. Thank you for the guys that comment every week, that like the videos, that subscribe to the channel as well. The subscriptions to the channel really does help us. So if you've enjoyed the content that I've put out, it's free. I don't charge for this content with the breakdowns and predictions. You've got an hour's worth pretty much every single week. We're on all podcast platforms as well, so if you are driving and commuting to work, you can flick Spotify on, or Apple Music, or Amazon, or however you listen to your podcast. But the bottom line is, if I'm helping you, if you're enjoying the content, if you've cashed a bet because of any of my predictions, the best way to repay me for that is just give a subscription to the channel for that breakdown and for that prediction. I really would appreciate it. That's the YouTube channel that I'm talking about, youtube.com/MMA Play 365. Again, just in case you're listening on one of the podcast platforms. Aside from that, we've got a phenomenal card this weekend. I hope you all enjoy the event. I hope you all cash your bets. Let's get it. And until next time, I'm Newsome. I'll see you next week.